All right, thank you. Drum roll, please. We normally don't have a full drum kit. We're more like the bongo types up here, but we'll do our best with the drums. So the first panel was actually billion-dollar bays, and you don't get billion-dollar bays with dirty water. So we're going to talk about water quality, clean water today. We have some of the most passionate guys I've ever met when it comes to water quality. We have Rob Brown, the Environmental Protection Division Manager from Manatee County Parks and Natural Resources Department. We've got Dave Tomasco, Principal Scientist with Environmental Science Associates, and John Ryan, the Environmental Manager from Sarasota County Public Utilities Department. So while these guys could spend 45 minutes talking about advanced wastewater treatment, we thought it might be a good idea to hear what you want to hear about. So we would like you to rate these questions, what it looks like you're already doing, on what you'd like them to discuss, and then we're just going to probably let them off the leash a little bit. We're definitely not as polished as the first panel. You can tell that they were executive directors. We're just guys that like water. So let's see what you want to hear, and we will do our best to try to talk about it. It's pretty close on the 3 and 4. So if you can't read it all, just say, what's our overall water quality compared to other areas? What's the role of water in restoring habitats? What's wrong with current stormwater management, water quality management systems of the future, and the future of water quality with population growth? So let me rank those real quick because I think we're going to turn that off. All right, perfect. It's not shifting too much more, so I think we'll just keep it there and keep it a little bit loose. So the close to number 1 was. What water quality management systems do we need to implement now to sustain natural functions for the next 20, 50, and 100 years? And that's a pretty broad one. John, do you want to maybe kind of kick us off with that a little bit and talk about future water quality management systems?
I think that the panelists from the NEP really covered the basics, and I think that makes our jobs a little easier, is that we have wastewater and stormwater. Those are the biggies. And as a guy who comes from a county, we're public servants and we have a lot of financial constraints and a lot of challenges. And people may not realize Sarasota County, this is where I work, so that's what I'll talk about, spent $120 million getting septic systems out of Philippi Creek. It's a lot for a person, but it's a lot for a program too. That's a lot of money. It's really hard to do, and we've only done 10,000. We need to do like 30,000 more. So the wastewater issue, I think everybody agrees, we need to work on it, but it's really expensive. And for infrastructure, stormwater too, working on stormwater, we want it, and I think this group, we don't have to convince you, we want clean water, but it's costly. So for us, it's a challenge. It's like, what do we do first? How do we accomplish it? Where do we get the money? And that's a really big challenge. So the wastewater thing, it's a well-established technology. We can get reclaimed water out of it. We can use for irrigation. So that part, I think, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I think that's kind of easy compared to stormwater, which is way more puzzling.
Yeah, from Manatee County's perspective, again, we're very lucky that early on Manatee County has got great infrastructure. They've had wastewater treatment pretty much throughout the county, very limited septic systems, which is great. But and you heard earlier with the Tampa Bay experience, we saw some major changes in Tampa Bay from the 70s. And that was primarily because of, again, the citizens and the elected officials back in the 70s. They passed what's called Grizzle-Figg Act, which required all wastewater treatment plants that had surface water discharges to Sarasota, Tampa Bay to be have advanced wastewater treatment, or they went through other options such as reclaim, reuse, and deep well injection. So what we did back in the 70s and early 80s in this region is what is lacking over what's happening in the East Coast. So they're having to play catch up. And so that was a big win for the Bays early on. And again, it was a regulatory thing, but it was supported by the citizens and the elected officials. But as John says, now, and one of the questions, which I think is very important, is how we're going to deal with the future growth. We have made some great accomplishments. We really want to learn from experience. As Dwayne explained to you, it doesn't take much to tip this thing to where we're playing catch up. So we have to stay vigilant, and we have to continue striving to maintain the gains that we had, and again, in a situation where we're getting expansive growth.
Dave, any thoughts on that one?
I don't exactly remember the question, but nonetheless, I think, so one of the things I think that really matches up is what John's talking about, what Rob's talking about, is this area has committed a huge amount of resources. Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay combined have spent over $1.5 billion, that's with a B, dollars to get where we are. It didn't happen by chance alone. We didn't just stumble upon, oh, there's better water quality and there's more seagrasses. It took a large amount of science that then drove the engineering, that then drove the policymakers to do that. And because of that, we've gained about 40 square miles of seagrass in the area from Tarpon Springs down to Boca Grande, about 40 square miles. You might have seen this recently in Chesapeake Bay. They've gained about 60 square miles, 17,000 hectares, about 65 square miles. And so what we're seeing is when you do the science that tells you what to do and then you go towards implementation and you spend the money, we can bring about ecosystem restoration on a grand scale. And, but you have to have in the back of your mind that we shouldn't be like fighting over budgets of $70,000. You know, can I get enough money to run an NEP? Are you kidding me? This place is worth so much more because of enhanced property values. Think of what it would be like along the waterfront if it got as bad as it was back in the 60s and 70s. Tampa Bay had an investment back in 1979 to upgrade their wastewater treatment plant, and it wasn't because of fish and crabs and shrimp and seagrass. It was because it smelled bad along the Interbay Peninsula. And you know, one of the big upgrades in the wastewater treatment plant in Manatee County was because it caused an algal bloom, and when the algal bloom died, it looked like toilet paper. And we'd like to think that we were all altruistic, but the reality is property values are affected by water quality, and that's been well known. And the other cool thing about having all this seagrass increase that's been a function of improved water quality, that's been a function of spending the money to fix it, Tampa Bay's pH is not going down, it's going up. And that's an observation first made by Ed Sherwood. So why is it going up? Because we've added so much more seagrass, and seagrass are able to sequester some of the added CO2. That may not be happening in Sarasota Bay. It may not be happening in all parts of Tampa Bay. But there is good news. Adding 100 square miles of more seagrass in Chesapeake Bay and Tampa Bay is good for ocean acidification. So, you know, we know how to recover systems on a large scale. We need to do more of it. But stormwater, wastewater, which is important? Both of them. And I'd just like to give another shout out to Grizzle Fig. These were two women legislators who back in the 70s asked, what was the problem, what should I do about it, and is there something we can do about it? And they did it, and the money was spent. And for the first couple of years, nothing happened. In Tampa Bay, for the first 3 years after the load reduction, nothing happened. So if you were doing the science, you probably look like an idiot. But because they had the foresight to know it's going to take a while, they actually kept doing it. And so whatever problems we identify with ocean acidification, we better get going because it's going to take a while for the recovery to kick in. Money and time is what you need. The science is there.
John.
One of the curious things about Grizzle Fig is it only applied to Southwest Florida. So a standard was created for surface water discharges that it had to be better. Didn't apply to all of Florida. It applied it to Southwest Florida, which probably was, I wasn't here, but probably people thought it was painful, but now it's paying off that same way.
It was state law geographically limited because they wanted it in this area. They didn't want it in Miami. Miami still discharges wastewater into the ocean. It's got much worse water quality than what the city of Palmetto does. And which one's got more money? You know, so this place had guts. Yeah. I mean, it is Miami.
I'd like to jump in again. Makes me think about the fertilizer ordinance. And people say, hey, you passed that fertilizer ordinance. When it was first passed, people came to people like me and said, show me that water quality is getting better. And in private, we laughed because it's a silly idea that, yeah, you'd fertilize less and then next month it's better. It's just not like that. Nutrients is complicated. There's a lot of nutrients tied up in algae and diatoms and most of it. but it's still fertilizer ordinance is a great idea. You don't need it on your yard. It's excess. But the payoff takes time. It's just smart thinking to not pollute.
So, I mean, along that timeline, when you think about, restoring for the future, to get where we need to get with the issues we have today, I mean, how many years is that? If you look in the past, how long it took to get us where we are with seagrass or water quality now?
Well, actually, in Tampa, it was, I think, quicker than we thought. I mean, when we first established seagrass criteria, in the 80s, and going, okay, and that's one of the things, water quality by itself is not really glamorous. It's laborious, it's time consuming, and if you're into instant gratification, don't get into that field, but it takes a long time, and you have to have a lot of data, and I think that's one of the real beautiful parts about what's happening in Southwest Florida is that the local governments, water management districts, DEP, everybody got involved in creating strategies for doing monitoring, for doing management plans and so forth. And you let the science dictate where you go. You don't make assumptions, head that direction, and then say, oops, as Dave said, grizzle fig it could have been a big problem if we didn't see results when you're spending that much money doing wastewater upgrades. Kind of made sense, but we need to have the data to prove that. And so, again, our local governments have been real supportive of maintaining these monitoring programs where we can do adaptive management. So when we set the goals in Tampa Bay early on, again, seagrasses were kind of the sentinel. This is the ultimate natural resource goal that we wanted to attain. How do you get there? So we knew that there was a paradigm of what's affecting seagrass growth. It's the amount of light hitting a certain depth of water where the seagrasses grow. Or what's affecting light? Well, it's what's in the water column, whether it's cloudy or clear. And what we were seeing was that with the chlorophylls, elevated chlorophylls. Well, what's causing the chlorophylls to be elevated? Got back to the nutrients. And again, in Tampa Bay and Sarasota being a nitrogen limited system, we chose to work on nitrogen. And so when you set those goals, you say, okay, we're going to set nitrogen and chlorophyll goals for Tampa Bay. How do you go about doing that? So you kind of survey what everybody's, putting in as far as loads. Sarasota Bay did the same thing. But then we had to go out and measure it. And measuring it throughout all of, a large watershed like Tampa Bay and even Sarasota Bay is very difficult. One person can't do it. One organization can't do it. So we created a kind of a coordinated effort called the Regional Ambient Monitoring Program, where we set up methodologies to go and do those samplings. And we, you think, I don't know, lab people here, but if you're in a lab, and of course there are certifications for labs and so forth, everybody thought they were doing the right thing and everybody was fine, but we never coordinated efforts. And again, something like Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay, has got to be a coordinated effort. And we got together and we all exchanged information, exchanged samples, and we found out our measurements were all over the board. We couldn't meet the standards that the estuary program had established. So with that effort, the RAMP evolved where all of our lab staff were meeting quarterly to dissect the methodologies from how you collect the water, how do you preserve it, how do you analyze it, to make sure that we had the best science and the best information available. And through that, we started seeing, positive results. And we started breaking down the jurisdictional boundaries. Manatee County sits on the policy management board of all three estuary programs. Every bit of the jurisdiction of Manatee County is in some managed system. So, we had to make sure that these management strategies were all the same. And with that, again, comes the creation of the data sets to be able to measure the results and then do adaptive management. As things, if you're seeing positive results, you keep moving. If you see something that's not quite right, you make the changes. So again, that's how you get there. It's a slow process. But again, going back to the original question is how, I didn't think I'd see seagrasses return to Tampa Bay in my career the way they have. And once we made the water right and got the water clarity right, nature took its course. Tampa Bay is not from replanting. It's a natural progression of increasing.
And that leads to a question that didn't rank quite as high, but I'll segue to it anyway, because I know Dave's really passionate about it, which is getting the water quality right. So what does that mean to get the water quality?
Well, I'd like to give a shout out to water quality monitoring, which is, Dwayne brought this up earlier, the models that are run, the models that run from the NEP suggested that everything was fine, the seagrass is fine. And who knew that the nutrients were actually in the macroalgae? Well, anyone who had actually spent time in Indian River Lagoon knew that there was an abnormally high amount of macroalgae in the lagoon. That's been documented back to the 70s. So as you move forward, there are things that are common sense that we can do. It doesn't make sense to have 150 houses on septic tanks upstream from a place where you're trying to grow oysters. And it doesn't make sense to have 10,000 septic tanks, draining into your bay. But at the same time, Sarasota Bay is not Tampa Bay, and Charlotte Harbor is not like either one of them. Charlotte Harbor didn't lose seagrass from 1950s to 1980s. So the management paradigm that works in Tampa Bay doesn't work in Charlotte Harbor. We have seagrass targets for Tampa Bay. In Sarasota Bay, we didn't set seagrass targets when we came up with a management plan because we didn't know what was happening. We just thought good things would happen. It sounds kind of naive, but we've become overly dependent upon complex mechanistic water quality models to help us figure out what to do. And that's just not been the case study. If you look at, there's plenty of examples across the world, in France and Australia, all over the place, where they've done the same thing we've done here. And we can learn from them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. But as I live in Tampa, and I love Tampa Bay's recovery, but Charlotte Harbor is not Tampa Bay. And the paradigm that works for them doesn't work for that. So that's why you have to collect data. Because data tells you what's happening. Data and field work would have actually told us that we have a macroalgae problem in Indian River Lagoon, and if that macroalgae dies, it's going to go into something else. And what it went into is phytoplankton. The models didn't pick it up, but people who actually were out there collecting data knew that. And so, get the water quality right. You can only do that if you collect water quality data, if you have monitoring data. And monitoring is not sexy. People want to go to ribbon cutting ceremonies for ponds. And that's cool. We need stormwater ponds. We need wastewater upgrades. But we also need to do enough data collection to figure out what's the problem. I worked for the Sarasota Bay Estuary program back in the 90s, and Mark Alderson was my director, if he's here. That dude deserves a heck of a lot of credit, because at our first policy committee meeting, I don't know if he remembers this, I'm going to embarrass him. Yeah, there he is. So he dressed up in a doctor's lab coat with a stethoscope, and he goes, we're not going to tell what needs to be done. We're going to give the bay a physical, and then we're going to figure out what needs to be done. And I'm going to have a management plan that fits on a sheet of paper. It's 11.5 by 17, but it is a sheet of paper. But he didn't, we didn't just come out and say, oh, we need to do this, we need to do that. We collected the data, we sampled the water quality, we analyzed it, we interpreted it. And what we tend to do now is we tend to use very complex models, or we actually decide we're going to do this one thing because it worked in one other area. And if you come in with a pain in your stomach, you don't run into the doctor and say, take my appendix out. They got to find out what's your problem. And that's what we did in this bay. And that's why this bay recovered so well, is because we took the time to do the data collection, to analyze it, interpret it, and come up with a management plan. And it worked. But every bay is going to be different. Indian River Lagoon is not going to work the way Tampa Bay worked. So collect the data to figure out what your problem is.
So we kicked off that first question with talking about water quality management systems and how to meet future needs. John, how do you think we're doing with current stormwater management systems, and how do you see the stormwater and canal systems operating in the future?
Great subject. I love stormwater. We started with stormwater standards in the 80s. And for those of you who don't know, most of it, it's those neighborhoods with a pond in it. That's the system. That is the standard system. And it works really great for flood control. So what that means is when it rains in a watershed, the rain comes out more slowly. So those ponds make the water come out slowly so that it's peak flow. So it works really great for that. You get pollution control credits for those ponds And they say it's about 30 or 40% effective in taking nitrogen out. Nitrogen is really big for us. Our bays are nitrogen limited. So it's fair to say that they work pretty good. But as you build more and more, you add more and more pollution because they're somewhat effective. So in one angle, I'd say we really need to figure out, and I think we should study and really understand what we're doing, and look at what do we think about our standards? Are these adequate? Are these design standards adequate? And I think many people would say they're not. And so you don't want to keep adding with the system you have. Really challenging thing to do. But stormwater is full of challenges. And I'll throw out something that was mentioned that Mark mentioned. In Sarasota County, in the past, we had a big wetland. Sarasota was a big wetland. If you look on old soil maps or anything, there were wetlands almost everywhere. So even the Indians dug ditches to drain the wetlands. But when the Europeans came here, our ancestors, they said, let's dig ditches and drain this stuff. And they just dug from one wetland to the next. And they filled in the wetlands and built houses on them. We're not having wetlands in the future. So now we have, in our county, predominantly a ditch system. Very expensive, 600 miles of canals that have water in them all year round. So if you think about the future of our community, you say, wow, do we really want to be a ditch community, a kind of a ugly linear ditch thing? And in the last couple of years, we started looking at people who do restoration of canals. And we're starting to learn about it. We still haven't built it into our thinking institutionally. And Mark is a big partner on this, of looking at things that cost us a lot of money to maintain. And what I would say in general is that we want to have streams instead of canals. And the reason is they take care of themselves much better than a canal. A canal requires constant work. You're always digging and dredging and having erosion and fixing it. And we have a consultant who's helping us now, a very sophisticated scientist, who's saying we can save money by moving towards a stream type thing. One of the things that's really exciting for us as a community is your property values, who if you live next to a canal, it may take away from your property value. You might have $20,000 less in property value because it's an ugly old canal out back. You got a fence up. And if you have a stream, you take that fence down and you put up a bench. Your property value goes up. That's money in your pocket, in all the people's pockets, and it's thousands of people. Just in Philippi Creek, there are 4,000 residential properties on our 100-mile canal system. If property values go up $50,000, that's $100 million. It's real money. It's in the pockets of people. So that's inspiring to us. We started, that's arithmetic, but we started looking at how do we engineer this? How do we find money to do it, which would be pricey. But in the very long term, and you've talked about this, we think working with nature is very consistent with the previous speakers today. It's really inconsistent with drainage engineering. It's a new paradigm for a huge number of engineering professionals who are good guys. They just didn't study this stuff in school. So I'm really hopeful about that. I think that could be great for our community. It's challenging. We will probably have failures. We'll probably do things that won't work out, and we'll have to learn from them. But we're trying not to. We really don't want to do it that way. So that's exciting stuff for me.
Well, I mean, it certainly seems that working with nature is important, but you've had some good success with the county with getting residents to work with nature. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, but it seems like...
Is Laura here? Laura Jensen, right there. Down in South Venice about, has it been 5 or 6 years ago? When I first started being a manager in the stormwater group, I was invited to a meeting in South Venice. It's a little community south of Venice. And it was a conflict type meeting. The neighbors had gathered together. There were like 15 people. There was a county commissioner in the room. And they were angry at the stormwater program. It was not friendly. And they said, you're ruining our neighborhood. You're digging these ditches in front of our houses. You've got this big canal out here. It's got all kinds of trash in it. We're not happy with what you're doing. It was adversarial. And over time, we got to be friends because they were right. It was a little hard to get used to, but they were right. So a really special set of talents in this South Venice Water Quality Task Force. And Laura's one of the drivers of it. She communicated, and they had a team, and the outcome was that we naturalized 2 canal systems in the South Venice area. And we learned a lot from it. It certainly added value, but probably the biggest lesson for me was working with the community and those special people who really want to make change is super powerful. They turned our utilities thinking. Really, they made that happen. That's how we got started on this other process. And it started out negative and turned into a really great partnership. And with SwiftMud, the Water Management District helped fund it. Quite an experience to see this. And just to wrap that up, for those of you who are in the public and you say, there's a guy working for the county, it's his job to make these changes, I would tell you, talk to your elected officials. You drive change. It's very hard for a manager guy in an organization to say, look, we're going to turn a new direction here. But when the public says they want something, and that's what Laura and her colleagues did, they're turning a battleship that turned very slowly, but it's turning because the public did it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I was going to wait till we jump into the development, but you kind of segued there with getting the community involved. I guess naively I thought when the recession hit and housing prices pummeled that maybe we were getting close to a carrying capacity and we had some future in Florida. People might get tired of losing money in house value and red tide and hurricanes, and then the economy came back and Irma didn't seem to make people flinch, and we recovered well. And red tide, we're building inland communities where people don't even go to the beach anymore. So for all of you, I mean, the question would be, what does the future hold for our bays with continued population growth?
That's a great question. That's the million-dollar question, is how can we sustain, the progress and the goals that we've made with this, increasing population. First off, we need to educate this population. If those of you that grew up in the area and knew, old Florida, it's really difficult. It seems like a perpetual cycle trying to get to homeowners associations, to get to new developments and so forth, to tell them this is what Florida is really about. It's not like it was in Ohio and New Jersey and so forth. It's different. So education is always going to be a big key. But again, as John pointed out, we're taking some of those natural systems, whether they had been altered by agriculture or other previous uses, but we're taking those natural systems and we're hardening them. And we know, impervious area is not conducive to water quality. So we've got to balance this new development in where we, again, historically we've looked at large regional, maybe stormwater ponds to take care of a development and so forth. And what the science is showing us now is, maybe that's not the best way to go. We probably need to be looking at more of treating it on site as best we can. I'm still in favor of swales. People don't like swales in front of their houses, but they work very well.
And it needs a really shallow depression with grass in it, not a big old structure.
You don't need a ditch. You just need some pervious area for the natural treatment and percolation.
Save the swales.
Save the swales. Right. So that's a challenge. And again, the challenge with the engineers, they touched on it earlier with sea level rise. There are studies on the East Coast now saying that the design of these systems now are not going to work in the future. As you increase sea level rise, everybody thinks it's a surface water issue. It's not. It's a groundwater issue as well. So what's happening is that our groundwater now is perched higher. These stormwater systems that take in the water during high rainfall events, then drain off, don't have time to relax and drain off. They're always staged high, so now we're having more of a flood effect. And then when you do that, you really don't provide the water quality treatment. So we're going to have to look at engineering, new criteria as far as, again, providing treatment closest to where the discharge is, minimize impervious areas, and again, it's going to be a challenge for us as we move forward. And again, to educate the people that, what we're doing is, I know, our IFAS folks have a task on their hand trying to educate the homeowners association of, why is this pond here in the first place? But, why are the fish dying, or this, that, and the other? But there's a whole movement now, again, with homeowners associations, with new residents. We can make these things better. We can do better with this. And Adopt a Pond program up north. Our folks are looking at more innovative ways to make it more user-friendly, more attractive, and actually function. So that's a big challenge that we're going to face, is to maintain the successes that we've had, and as we move forward, and again, we know it can be done. Tampa's done. Where we are now, with over 1 million people coming in the last decade. So, but it's a challenge, and again, stormwater is going to be a real issue.
Dave, you're good at quotes. Was it John D. McDonald quote?
John D. McDonald, right? So the guy wrote The Green Flash, before Carl Hyacin, and his comment was, the problem with Florida is no one's from here, and they don't remember how beautiful it is. It used to be. But he wrote that in the 70s, all right? So now we have the opposite problem, because now a lot of people don't remember how bad it was in the 70s and 80s. Tampa Bay is much cleaner than it was 30, 40 years ago. So is Sarasota Bay. So is Clearwater Harbor and St. Joseph Sound and Lemon Bay. Has more seagrass than it had back in the 1980s. So am I, overly optimistic, naive? My wife would say yes. But I think that we can do a good job, because we have done a good job. There's not a lot of, I work all over the country and in different countries, and you would not get this many people in Alabama talking about water quality. And so you guys are the reason why I have a job, and I love my job, and I think that I'm optimistic about the future, because what we've been able to do, there's a lot more people in Tampa Bay. There's a much healthier economy. I mean, we used to be like strip clubs and call centers. Now we have more than that. And so, our economy's bigger, we got more people in here, and yet we have a cleaner bay. We have a bay as clean as it was in the 50s, and in Sarasota, and in Clearwater Harbor, and in St. Joseph Sound. So this area has done it because we've done, enough science to turn it over to the engineers and the policymakers to institute these things. Stormwater, absolutely, we can do a better job with stormwater, but look at Lemon Bay around that area. They have as much seagrass as they had back in the 1940s. And there was no NEP there for a long time. But what there was a level of cheapness about infrastructure that served them well. So rather than having streets with curbs and gutters and storm drains that took it and ran it right out into the bay like we do in South Tampa, they had swales.
Save the swales.
Save the swales. and because of that, they actually had a stormwater BMP built right into their development. So drive around Englewood, around the Lemon Bay shoreline, and you'll see how we should develop, because that actually allowed 50% urbanization without all the problems with stormwater. So yeah, we can do a good job. We've shown it. We can do more.
So you talked about how well we're doing here in the local area. How do we compare with the rest of the nation as far as?
We look fantastic. I mean, seriously. So we have a law that says you can't discharge nitrogen higher than 3 milligrams per liter wastewater. They don't have that on the East Coast. They don't have that in Miami. The average wastewater treatment plant in San Francisco has 27 milligrams per liter nitrogen, 9 times as high. Santa Clara River Estuary in California has 10 milligram per liter nitrate. So these, Morro Bay, NEP, if any guys talk to the NEP director, Morro Bay, they have 10 milligram per liter nitrate coming into their bay, and they wonder why they lost all their seagrass. So, this place is like, I use this place as an example of how to restore water quality in places all over the world. So I work in Saudi Arabia, and I tell people this is what you need to do, because this place is frankly one of the leading examples of ecosystem restoration on a large scale. So I think we're doing a great job. Doesn't mean there's no challenges. We're doing a great job. And thank the politicians that actually allowed this to happen, and the taxpayers are paying the bills for it. It's not us.
So you use the anecdote of Mark Alderson on dressing up as a doctor. So does the patient's healthy? Does it look good for the future? And does that mean we can stop exercising and go drinking and just have fun? Or are we about to have a heart attack or a stroke?
So there's like this scene in the movie, The Perfect Storm, right? So like they've gone through one half of the storm and they think everything is awesome because the sun comes out. And then like they realize, oh my God, we're only in the eye of the hurricane. Then they have the rest of it. And potentially that's where we are, because we've solved the eutrophication issue, but now we got climate change and ocean acidification. But I'm not completely bummed, because I think what's going to happen is we're going to retreat from the coast. And I think it's going to be driven by real estate. I think people are going to realize it's a pain in the ass to live in a neighborhood where it floods every high tide when it rains. That's happening right now. In Tampa Bay, in Gulfport, I'm not going to move there, because it floods when it rains on a high tide. And we're going to see more and more of that. And when that happens, the same people that pushed for the eutrophication fix of Sarasota Bay are going to push for, help me retreat from the coast. So I think we are going to retreat from the coast, and I think it's going to be driven by property values. And I think it's going to happen within the next mortgage cycle. That's just me.
That's just you. How about you, John? What do you think about that as far as our stormwater infrastructure and the health of the Bay for the future?
Could you rephrase that?
Well, sea level rise on stormwater infrastructure was Dave was leading it, but the original question was, how's the patient doing? Are we good? Can we just go ahead and relax and enjoy our senior years here? Or are we going to be imminent in a heart attack here?
Oh, I don't know about the heart attack. I'm more interested in what do we do? How do we move forward? I'm not a gloom and doomer. I think it's good to think about our situation and the things we've lost and the things that, I think looking at the past is really valuable, because the past year was amazing. Just crazy amounts of fish and birds, crystal clear water. People alive today will tell you those stories. So I think that's important. But I think the challenge is a person who loves nature, and like all of you, is that we have to work on it. And it never will be done. There'll never be a time when we say, oh, we can ignore that now. I just don't think that will ever happen. I don't see that. Some things can be. Flood control can actually be finished. You can build enough structures to say, yeah, we controlled it, we're done. Things can be done that way. You can have a big enough wastewater plant, but the stormwater thing, that's us. That's our backyards. It falls from the sky pretty clean. It gets dirty on our property, and that's a challenge for all of us. So I don't think it'll always be a challenge. It's something and the other thing is, and the NEP directors talked about this, is the water is really different than it was. There used to be these vast amounts of fish. That's the chemical balance. Some of it's in living things, a lot of it. And it's different. And so the ecosystems are different. And we barely understand them, in my opinion. Seriously, when the oil spill happened, I asked fish experts from Fish and Wildlife, I said, so what's the baseline on oil and fish in the Gulf? And they said, we don't know anything about it. Amazing, huh? But they had to learn it. They had to learn it after. That just shows how much is left to be learned. And so, young scientists, there's a whole world of things that you can study in your life. There's so much left to be known.
So do you think we'll always be reaching for that next bar? So seagrass is healthy, water quality is improving. We'll be trying to restore scallops and get back to eating shellfish in the bays?
Oh, yeah. It's actually, we haven't even talked about TMDLs, which is total maximum daily load. It's the driving force to cure water pollution in the United States. It comes from the Clean Water Act. It's a weird acronym. But what it says is you have to take pollution out of the water body until it functions right. And what that means is you have to be able to eat the things in there. The fish and shellfish have to be edible. You have to be able to do recreation and not be poisoned or sickened by it in any way. And the things that live there have to live a full life cycle. So fish and shellfish and wildlife have to be able to reproduce, live out their lives. And the reason that they set that standard is it makes perfect sense. That's the way the world always was. And so that's the outcome. Water chemistry is the blood pressure or some other very important measure of health. But the ultimate goal of the Clean Water Act is that. They call it designated use. It has to be useful water bodies. Until that happens, we're not done. That's complicated. That's complicated. You can purify water and purify it, and you still may have all kinds of challenges. But TMDLs drive a lot of things. We are required by law to achieve those standards. Every community has water bodies that are polluted. It's called impaired water bodies. We all have them. I think we have 56 in Sarasota County. Nothing special, just like the rest of Florida, bacteria and nutrients and some other stuff. Everybody has these challenges.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, yeah, TMDL is nothing new. It's been in the Clean Water Act since '72. It's just no one's ever implemented it. And
Until a lawsuit was filed
Correct.
by citizens. Including
And once-
Becky Ietch in Mayaca City.
Right, and once the citizens, spoke up, how are we going to do this? Now, this is a challenge for us. We've been primarily talking about the bays and the health of the bays. The bays are the end members. As John mentioned, these TMDLs, this regulatory aspect of it, and I'm in the regulatory field, and we regulate and are regulated, and each one of us has a NPDES MS4 permit, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System permit, which says that we have to meet certain water quality criteria, and especially in these areas that have TMDLs or impaired waters, not only do we have to do projects and monitoring and everything to improve the bay, but all of these watersheds too. Probably got 75, 80 different watersheds. You all live in a watershed. Whether you like it or not, you're in a watershed. Okay? And everything that comes from your backyard goes into the nearest surface water, whether it's a stormwater system or a creek or a river, and those are in confined basins. It's our job to make sure that those basins meet water quality criteria as well and their designated use. So now our big effort, after working on the bay, as we go up into the watersheds and start looking at individual communities, and you'll see us, we do, for the fecal coliform or the bacteriological impairments, we do the walk the Wibbit or walk the water body to look for sources of pollutants. So now, again, our effort is primarily because of the TMDL's challenges and our NPDES requirements, we're moving a lot more up into the watershed. And, as we mentioned earlier, the more we can naturalize these systems now, the more benefit that we'll get as far as water quality goes, habitat, and so forth. So we're coming full circle, I think. We're going back to Mother Nature and letting it do the treatment for us instead of doing the engineered mechanical type treatment.
And I think getting back to Mother Nature, the big challenge we always have here and all over the country is getting maybe some of the natural systems back, but the hydrology is one of the biggest challenges. And what do you all think about that? How important is it to get the hydrology? We talk a lot about water quality, but you can't just get oysters back with water quality.
So I think you've got really good examples in the state of Florida. We were ditching and draining Florida before people moved here because of things like foot rot. Cows, get foot rot and their feet are wet, so we drain the landscape. Indian River Lagoon has an awful lot more land that used to drain to the St. Johns River. It now drains the Indian River Lagoon. And Donna Bay, right there by Venice, has a watershed that's 5 times bigger than it was historically because we're a flat place where it rains a lot. And the easiest way to drain your land is to ditch it the closest to tide because it's a function of the slope. So if it takes you 10 miles to go to salt water, if it takes you 2 miles, you're going to build the 2-mile thing. So Donna Bay's watershed was expanded 5-fold. Naples Bay's watershed is 10 times as big as it used to be because it carved land out of the Rookery Bay watershed. So we have examples all over the place like that. Faca Union Bay has too much water in the wet season, too little in the dry season because it's been ditched and drained. So we've drained it so effectively in the wet season, there's nothing left in the dry season for it to perk out. So that's a real big problem. In a lot of places, that's a bigger issue than nutrient pollution, for example. The state of Florida does have a program to do MFLs, minimum flows and levels. And so there's been a lot of progress. The Upper Peace River used to run dry every single dry season. It hasn't run dry in the last couple of years because the Water Management District spent over $150 million to raise the lake level for Lake Hancock. And now you have a water level that allows fish to swim up and down. Didn't used to happen that way. So I think there's some really good things. But I would like to just give a shout out to doing good science. So MFLs have the time and the resources to do a good job. There are TMDLs that are good. There are TMDLs that are horrible. That are based on awful targets. And so I would say, make sure your standard makes sense, make sure the projects make sense. Spend the time, because it's a lot cheaper to do a couple $10,000 to verify if this thing makes sense than to spend millions of dollars on projects that don't work. The City of Winter Haven has spent millions of dollars to fully meet their TMDL obligations for Lake May, Ship, and Lulu. Water quality hasn't changed at all in either of those lakes. But they met their TMDL. So TMDL was wrong, and their targets were incorrect. So get the science right, come up with projects that work. Don't just defer to whatever DEP or EPA says. Do it the right way the first time, then come up with projects that'll work. Because we can even fix lakes. Lake Hancock's the best water quality it's had in decades. It was called the most polluted large lake in Florida. It's not going to be anyone's ideal lake. But if you know what that lake used to look like, go out and look at it now. It's remarkably better. Water clarity has doubled in that system. But I don't know what I was talking about.
Keep going, Dave. It's good.
Hydrology. We started with hydrology.
Oh yeah,
we started
hydrology,
with
there you go. So the key with Lake Hancock was they recovered the lost capacity. That lake was dropped 2.2 feet, and they raised it 1.3 feet. So it's now in contact with 1,000 acres of wetlands it didn't used to be in contact with. There was no big stormwater retrofit that was done. There was no wastewater treatment plant that got taken offline. They restored the hydrology, and they took Florida's most polluted large lake, and it got it better. Lake Okeechobee, all sorts of problems. Okeechobee is 7 feet lower than it was historically. There's no wetland fringe the way they used to be because the lake's been lowered. It got lowered because it was overflowing and flooding the Everglades agricultural area where we're growing all the sugar cane. So altered hydrology, it's sometimes more important than nutrients for fixing our systems.
Yeah, one of the important projects that everybody's working on right now, it's really exciting. We have water quality criteria in our freshwater systems, and we have water quality criteria for our estuarine systems. You know, they're different. Estuaries function differently than their freshwater systems. But one of the key habitats that we've kind of overlooked, and it's difficult, and that's why we kind of do put up the difficult things till you know the very end of the process. But with all 3 estuary programs, we kicked off a study a couple of years ago looking at our tidal creeks, how important our tidal creeks are. We don't have standards for those, and you know, we're talking about incorrect TMDLs. You know, when we're measuring in a tidal creek, they need the DEP and EPA tells us we have to meet the estuarine criteria, which would make us have to clean them up, and they don't need to be cleaned. They need to be have higher nutrients. They need to be kind of dirty water. This is where the juvenile fish hatch and where they breed, and without those habitats we wouldn't have the functioning fisheries that we have now. So again, taking the lead, this group, with these estuary programs, we've kicked off a study to look at the fisheries, the water quality, everything in those tidal creek systems, and we're going to establish what the proper criteria are. And hopefully, EPA is very supportive of that, so is DEP. But those are the missing data points that we don't have. And so, like I said, there's always something else to do. You've got to get the hydrology right, the water quality right, all of these things. Nothing's mutually exclusive. Everything works together. Again, those tidal creeks don't function without proper flow, and you need the flow. So again, there is no one fix and there's no one solution.
One of the fun things that happened in there is everybody knows, everybody learned at school, low dissolved oxygen is bad, simple, black and white. And then we started engaging in this conversation and talking with fisheries guys, and they came into these meetings and said, snooks seek out low oxygen environments. They'll nestle into mud, black muck, nasty muck that anybody would say, let's fix that, let's dredge that stuff out. The low oxygen environment is a place they can thrive. Tarpon, I'm sure she mentioned, can go in those low oxygen environments. It's part of what we're supposed to have here. But by normal things, you say, hey, low oxygen, we're in trouble. Dave taught us years ago, low oxygen in seagrass beds on a perfect sunny day. It didn't meet standards. Way back in the 90s, you were telling us.
Local knowledge is really a good thing. And so, if tarpon were in a creek that met the DO criteria that the state of Florida used to have, there wouldn't be tarpon there. Because, there's this thing called a refuge from competition. And that means the reason why they seek out these low DO areas is because if it was higher DO, there would be bass in there. And they would be eating all the baby tarpon and snook. So nature has not always met our DO criteria. And we know that we've had low oxygen in wetlands for millions of years, because that's how you get peat and coal and natural gas. So can you make Sarasota Bay fail the DO criteria? Yeah, you can make it artificially, but you know, I guess I have this like question authority. Just because DEP says it or EPA says it, you might want to double check. Come up with your own criteria that are based on science and people who actually spend time in the field, and then go from there. And if you make EPA happy, great. If you don't, oh well. Do the right thing anyway.
So we're just about out of time for our panel discussion, but if you do have time, you know, track these guys down. They have a lot of really great stories about success in the area. One thing that age does bring is you get to witness some of these things. So they've been around long enough to see a lot of the efforts that they've put in come to fruition. We're going to go open up for questions. I think we have about 5 minutes left. But before we do you guys have any quick things you want to pass on to the new generation of folks coming out, or any words of wisdom? Go ahead.
I have a story. We had another panelist who couldn't make it today. Our stormwater manager, Ben Quartermain, local guy, loves his life here, and he was involved in designing the Celery Fields Regional Stormwater Facility. And we were talking about this session, and he said, I was working for a consultant back when they were building it, and they said, we're going to build boardwalks with gazebos out in the middle of the celery fields. And he thought, what a waste of money. And he was saying, I had no idea what was going to happen when we built this flood control facility. And we had to do wetland mitigation. Turned out to be immensely popular with birds and people and fitness people. It was just not in the world view. And it was really funny to hear him say that. And so I would say, a lot of these infrastructure things may be your favorite thing. And it might not be built for that reason. But by thinking bigger than the narrow things of our own and other people's thought processes, we can get much better things.
Excellent. You guys want to turn around and see if there's any of those that pique your interest to answer? We probably have 3 minutes left, maybe.
Oh, okay. I'll take that bottom one since it's probably me. Lakes May, Ship, and Lulu in Winter Haven. Oh, I'm sorry. Which lakes met their TMDL? They're not getting better.
Oh.
SHIPPMAY and then LULU.
All right.
$7 million spent.
And that's because the wetlands were the solution.
Yeah, altered hydrology was more important than the magic stormwater pond at the bottom of the hill. And what we've suggested instead is, as was mentioned earlier, treat your stormwater on site. Basically use things like rain gardens. You drive down University Parkway and you see the stormwater runoff from the road doesn't go into a drainage ditch, a concrete pipe, it goes into a swale. And then when that swale overloads, it goes to another swale. And then when that overloads, it goes to a storm drain system. So the last thing you do is use concrete hardened stormwater conveyance. So the vast majority of rain events, the water soaks into the ground. That's what you want to do. They didn't do that. They just built, the magic pond, and it didn't work.
There's a question up there about preserved lands and Sarasota Bay water quality restoration. Are we doing a good job in preserving the watershed component of it?
We are in Manatee. I mean, thanks to Damon and Charlie, I mean, we're very lucky that we have both coastal and inland preserves with Duet and Robinson preserves, which are, again, diamonds. And we show how very important that is to preserve those natural systems and, again, enhance those. And again, Duet right now, it had historically been impacted by agriculture and so forth. And we're doing major projects out there, again, to restore the hydrology, protect our surface water supply. So again, Manatee County has been very proactive and, without a dedicated funding source to go out there and get these preserves.
As far as converting canals into a stream-like thing, that's a preview of coming attractions. Dr. John Kiefer will be presenting about urban ecology, and he's our consultant. Brilliant guy. Go to that session.
All right, I think we're going to close it at that. We're out of time, and we want to thank our panelists for coming, and thank you all for listening.